Neverspring Chronicles might tell its story a little differently from your average JRPG because it was inspired by cinema. It was the YouTube channel Film Courage that taught me to listen to all the things left unsaid, that the idea behind show, not tell, is deeper than the sum of its words. Likewise, I started to wonder if mapping in a JRPG could be more than just giving the player a ground to walk on. They say you should write what you know, and here is where that truly begins. I stayed conscious of specifically not doing any kind of self-insert, so I could learn to write actual characters with their own voice. Whatever need I may have had for self-expression was channeled into the mapping process. I had an unusual childhood, and at one point I spent a lot of time exploring sewer networks and drainage systems, ducking transients and bad adults more than once. My experiences taught me to see the world around me as dark and dangerous. The imagery I chose for the upper and lower sewers is meant to communicate a sort of innocence lost. The spirit of Merrick and Vanessa are archetypes, people I grew up with, people who fell through the cracks of society, walking in the shadow between light and dark out of necessity. The world these people live in is dying, strangled by ambition, excess, waste, and neglect. But the characters that live in it are different. Merrick is pragmatic and sometimes jaded, but refuses to give up. Vanessa is clever, caring, and full of hope. The dystopian aesthetic is meant to be a backdrop for the characters. Neverspring Chronicles at its heart is about good people in a bad world and the second chances that eventually come with time. For this part of the first dungeon, I went with a less is more approach. I couldn't offer flashy, clean graphics or cutting-edge mechanics, so I tried to focus on all the little things that shape an experience. On the final descent, I tried mapping the stairwell in a way that might build anxiety in the player and trigger the anticipation that something could go terribly wrong. This is also the player's first look at Imperial architecture, so I dropped the lighting effects to make everything bright and sterile, to communicate something cold, clean, and logical beyond compassion. I also tried to make the maps both wide open and confining at the same time, to evoke a sense of that false freedom that the Gangtaka Empire gave to this world. Although Neverspring started out in a traditional fantasy setting, it eventually became what you see today, because it always seemed odd to me that simply having magic in a world would somehow lock the people of that world into the same level of technology indefinitely. I imagined that humans wouldn't stop at swords and shields just because a wizard could wipe out an army. On the contrary, the humans I know would find a way to build something stronger than that wizard's magic in order to compensate. Neverspring takes place in a world that kept progressing, eventually harnessing magic into mass production to even the playing field. In the game's expanded timeline, the humans were able to reverse engineer ancient technology from the ruins of a previous civilization. Magitech requires mana as a sort of energy, with gold and mithril as conductors. Mana is a finite resource, and so the Mage Hunter era was all about hunting down magical artifacts to break down and recycle mana. Everything from old spellbooks to legendary treasures were broken down and harvested, until so much had been removed from the world that they began to hunt down magical creatures. In this dungeon, the old hedge wizard points out the skull of a titan, with its brain kept alive for its processing power. The player enters Neverspring around a time when it has become easier to simply harvest mana from other magic users. One of my biggest mapping mistakes was in mapping things out before I was done writing. As the story coalesced, I wound up having to abandon places that didn't fit anymore. I also had to come up with totally new places that didn't feel shoehorned in at the last minute. I wound up needing some kind of barrier between the Empire and the frontier, and I already had 2 or 3 different mountain maps and cave zones. I needed something I didn't have yet, but also something that made sense. I mentioned in a previous video that I had lost my home at one point during the development process. I had to break camp every 2 weeks to avoid squatting, so I got to see everything from deep forest to swampland. The appearance of outdoor maps in Neverspring are very much a result of what I noticed around me during those 4 months. The Misty Marshes seen here are inspired by one of my campsites. The wooden bridges were inspired by a swamp somewhere in Europe I once read about where the Romans were bitterly defeated by the Celts. Legend has it that the Romans weren't prepared to fight on the rickety wooden causeways overlaying the thick swamp mud. Through reading, I learned that swamps and marshes make for excellent natural barriers, so I thought back to what I noticed most about swamps: the moisture, the bugs, the broken pools of stagnant water left over from the rise and fall of water levels, and the dead trees drowned out by the overabundance of water. One small touch I added that I don't see in other games is the trash. No matter how deep I explored any swamp or forest I camped at, you would be amazed at the collection of trash you find, even miles away from any signs of human life. Oddly enough, that observation didn't hold as true in the mountains. The Smoldering Highlands seen here are inspired by my time in upstate New York in the mountains of the Adirondacks, where my French and Mohawk ancestors fought in the French and Indian War. There, it was often clean, and the rocks jutted out from the earth in a beautiful way that was very different from my experiences in the Appalachian Mountains. The layout of this area is slightly different from the other outdoor areas in Neverspring, because it was around this time that I was researching level design. Neverspring Chronicles was designed to be as close to a 90s SNES JRPG as possible, because in my mind, my target audience was myself over 20 years ago. I kept a vision in my mind of my game existing as an old SNES cartridge, and many of my decisions were based on whether or not that younger version of me would want to pop that cartridge in and play. So I studied level design by poring over the old maps from games that inspired me, namely Final Fantasy IV in regards to the Smoldering Highlands. The narrow climbs, the overlapping ridges, and the downward-facing entrances are all throwbacks to Mount Ordeals. Even the fight with the goons is a sort of Easter egg from the fight with Millen, the Earth Fiend. I found this strategy to be very useful because the problem I had with my level design wasn't so much the mapping itself as it was the overall layout and length of the area. I had a problem with making my levels too direct, and therefore too short to really be enjoyable. The questions I needed to answer were things like, how many rooms should there be? How should I transition from common areas to something important? What maps are too big? What maps are too small? Studying level design in this way helped me to unpack my level ideas into more expansive and complete areas without making the player feel like they were being given a bunch of extra zones simply to pad playtime. Although it isn't a JRPG, one of the games that really shaped my gaming experience growing up was Diablo 2. To anyone watching that has also played that game, you might have noticed right away that the Sanctum pulls inspiration from the Arcane Sanctuary in Act 2. The Eldritch Knights of the Gangtaka Empire are granted a lot of autonomy, and as such, many of them continue the tradition of the great mages of old, hiding away in isolated strongholds, towers and sanctuaries dedicated to the study of magic. Older knights left over from the Mage Hunter era are known for keeping trophies, rare and valuable magic artifacts that they either hid away for personal use or collected for posterity, unwilling to bring themselves to destroy something they cherished. This dungeon was particularly fun to map because it was very different from anything else in the game. It was also an opportunity to showcase some of how the everyday world works in Neverspring. Golems, for instance, were around well before Magitech, and so the people of this world naturally extended the term to encompass the drones and robots that replaced their old constructs of wood and stone. There was a lot I wanted to say about the world that simply didn't move the story forward, and so I did my best to entice the player's imagination, directing their what-ifs with little details here and there. Believe it or not, I never played any Elder Scrolls games until I had already written the lore for Neverspring Chronicles. When I encountered the Dwemer in Elder Scrolls Online, it took me a few years to realize they were dwarves. By the time I noticed the parallels between the dwarves of Elder Scrolls lore and the dwarves of Neverspring, it was too late. The very first draft of Neverspring in 2004 was initially an adaptation of the Book of Enoch, which was rare knowledge at the time. But when Diablo 3 came out, I threw that idea in the trash. I was heartbroken that not only had they beat me to it, but I felt they did a terrible job, as if the whole Nephilim thing was just an afterthought layered over the game, and so I wasn't about to do it again. To be honest, I don't know a lot about the Dwemer, only that they died out and left behind constructs just like the dwarves in Neverspring. The Dwarven Underways quickly became a lesson in knowing when to quit and learning how to avoid lore dumps. It was painful to realize that I had all this cool stuff and none of it served to move the story forward. Far in Neverspring's past, the dwarves dug too deep and encountered a race of insectoids. The resulting conflict wiped out the dwarven society, but no one knows how or why. And every now and then a lone dwarf wanders up to the surface from somewhere, always afflicted with the same mysterious curse of unreasonable aggression and murderous savagery. But I had no way of telling the player all this without going wildly off track, so I focused on atmosphere and vibe. I used chasms and pitfalls to try to create a sense of endless depth. On the cart ride in, I purposefully held the travel time just a little too long, hoping to evoke an unsettling feeling in the player as the ride finishes just as the music changes into something ominous. I had said earlier that one aspect of the fantasy genre which always stood out to me was that society never seemed to progress. The Gorloks are a direct product of imagining a post-fantasy fantasy world. The emergence of Magitech completely changed the balance of power almost overnight, and the time-old enemies of mankind were punished severely because of it. Orcs, goblins, and ogres were forced underground where their societies mingled and interbred until they became the Gorloks. Traces of each lineage can be seen in the varying shapes and sizes of individual Gorloks, while genetic traits like the orc's thirst for battle or the speech impediment from the goblin jaw tick spasms became universal. They were initially meant to be nothing more than Neverspring's version of the orc archetype, but I decided to take a short story that I wrote and adapt it into Neverspring Chronicles, which enriched the overall gameplay with the Ogun, Gobsworth, and Natasha story arc. The Gorlok Den is the oldest dungeon map in Neverspring. As a result, the layout is somewhat chaotic, but I wound up keeping it that way because it suited the Gorloks. They do not build, they inhabit, and so they tend to populate the cave systems littered with ancient ruins. This part is going to sound very strange, because if I provide any real context, then this will turn into a 3-hour video. The old logging road is probably the oddest part of the game in my opinion, because I imagine it seems a bit out of place among the grand scheme of things. The old logging road is actually home to some of my most favorite lore in the game world, and I had to cut it all. Almost everything you see or hear in this area is a setup for the next game. Dunkargo's past, Olesadel's past, the Roden Lago, Ripfang, and Deadpaw. If it wasn't for the fact that the player needed to go there to find a certain item, I would have had to cut it entirely. The Roden Lago hold a special place in my heart, because they were born out of my experience living among mice. Mice taught me how to overcome my social anxieties when I was younger. Mice taught me how to suffer with dignity. Mice even taught me how to talk to girls. I watched what must have been 100 generations rise and fall. I became fascinated with their behavior, and we became friends to the point that they ate from my plate, they slept in my bed, they even rode along in my hoodie regularly. They are so stubborn when they're young that you don't realize they even think of you until they come to you to die in their old age. I watched 1,000,000 tiny dramas unfold, 1,000,000 tiny lives of comedy and tragedy lived out in obscurity with nothing but my memories to prove they were even here at all. The characters and stories of the Roden Lago are directly pulled from these tiny moments of victory and defeat that I was privileged to have witnessed. Roden Lago society is matriarchal, except during the maternal blood, when the males have to protect the newborns from the females. The player who reaches this point in the game knows they must fight Ripfang. What they don't know is that Ripfang is Deadpaw's older brother, who was barely able to save him during the maternal blood. Though he survived, most of Deadpaw's leg was eaten, leaving him crippled. But it didn't stop Deadpaw from becoming one of the fiercest fighters of the Roden Lago. What happens to Ripfang when Olesadel's secret is revealed is meant to be a catalyst for important events in the next game. The Imperial Frigate is the shortest, most linear dungeon of the game because, well, it's just a ship. I did some research into the layout of military vessels in the Age of Sail, and let's just say that even with what you see here, I was being overly generous with the size and room available on your average frigate. This dungeon is found when choosing Merrick's arc after the player party splits up and the gameplay forks into 3 different journeys. In all honesty, it's rather unremarkable right now. I may need to touch it up with 1 or 2 dungeon mechanics to keep things engaging. There's not a lot of combat in Merrick's fork. As a thief and smuggler, he's used to slipping in and out of places he isn't supposed to be, and I tried to keep the average player's sense of fatigue in mind as I neared the end of the game. So this part of the game focuses on moving the player forward through the story. Here, the player meets Ethne, a character actually meant for the next game that was pulled forward into Phoenix Down to fill a role. There were many decisions like this I had to make along the way. Important characters in Neverspring are usually characterized by a face portrait in their dialogue box. The kind of player that checks every corner of the game or talks to everyone may encounter NPCs with facial graphics that don't seem to be a part of the story. These are characters the player will encounter in the second game, should I get the chance to finish developing it. Some characters were pulled forward, others were pushed back. It may not be apparent to the player, but Merrick's friend Vanessa was actually a last-minute addition to the Phoenix Down rewrite. She was originally an NPC in Bridgeton that helps the player join the mercenary guild farther on in the overall story of Neverspring. There was a time when I used to hold myself back by thinking that once I wrote something, it was set in stone and couldn't be changed. One day, I saw an interview with George Lucas talking about how different the original Star Wars story was from the one that made it to the big screen. At one point, Luke and Leia weren't even related. Luke was like an old general, and Anakin was his apprentice. They weren't related either. And the character that became Vader was somebody else entirely. Somehow seeing that interview cured me of the fear that I couldn't change something once it was written. The map I made for Lugae's fortress is a special one. It's my official salute to the first JRPG I ever played start to finish and completed. The entire map is an Easter egg, and devout fans of Final Fantasy IV might recognize the layout if they look closely. And I do encourage players to look closely. Neverspring Chronicles is a game heavily laden with secrets. The secrets in this level, however, are more cryptic than in other parts of the game. There are 2 hidden Steam achievements coded into this area that are also Easter eggs to Final Fantasy IV. As a hint, one is called the Black Knight, and the other is called Time Heals All Wounds. Here the player has their confrontation with one of the game's 2 main antagonists, Inquisitor Lugae, a character who, over the course of development, went from a small bit player NPC to a well-rounded villain with solid motivation. Natural-born magic in Neverspring is hereditary. Inquisitor Lugae was born into a noble house and destined to become an Eldritch Knight, until it was discovered that he was born mundane, unable to use magic. He struggled all his life to keep up with his peers, leveraging his intelligence to become a master of Magitech, eventually becoming head of Magitech development for the Empire. But he has neither forgotten nor forgiven, being cast aside and ridiculed for being born as he was. The Ashen Roost is the final dungeon of the game. The Phoenix used to roost atop the highest point in the land, that being the top of the old dwarf tower which rises way up from the Underdeep to overlook the mountains from which it springs. The first version of this area was a bit bland, as it was basically just a monster-filled dungeon crawl. I had plans for this dungeon initially, but I assumed that players might be fatigued at this point and just want to beeline it to the end. I couldn't be happier that I was wrong. Thanks to the critique and feedback of players, I felt justified in going back and upgrading it into what it is now. The dungeon has 2 distinct stages with different enemies and mechanics. The story has the player entering the tower much lower than the characters had hoped. This deep underground, the tower interior is wrecked beyond repair, and almost none of the dwarf tech works anymore. Over the centuries, various strange creatures from the Underdeep have found their way into the tower, crawling up from the lower levels to wander in the shadows of the crumbling halls and rusty stairways. The player will have to cannibalize parts from the wreckage and debris of fallen guardians and broken constructs to provide bursts of temporary power to the ancient dwarven facility. As the player ascends the dark lower levels this way, they eventually reach one of the redundant reactors to power an elevator to the dungeon's next phase. The second half of the dungeon is the upper floors of the tower. Though still badly damaged, the systems in this area seem to still be working somewhat. The lights are on, leftover security measures are still active, and ancient dwarven constructs still roam the halls in search of an enemy long gone on behalf of a society they already failed to protect. Although there is high-quality treasure throughout the dungeon, it's here in the second phase that some of the game's best accessories are guarded by 3 different sub-bosses. It is also in this phase of the dungeon that I felt I could get away with sprinkling some lore crumbs around. The lighting effects aren't just for show. Some screens and terminals will turn on while they are receiving power, and for the curious player, there are logs left over from the inhabitants that piece together what happened to the dwarves of Neverspring. On the last floor, just before the tower's summit, the most powerful of the dwarven constructs still guards the bones of its fallen creators. Once defeated, the player can safely climb to the Ashen Roost to reignite the Phoenix cycle and restore balance to the world. That is, of course, if they can beat the final boss and become a hero.